Our sources don't say she stopped the grain. She just controlled it. What she's trying to do isn't necessarily, cut off a lifeline, cut off, Rome's food supply, but she's making the point that, it's now sort of, administered by her.
What leadership lessons can we learn from history's most powerful people? I'm entrepreneur Mike Soutar, author of Next Gen CEO. You may also have seen me scrutinising candidates' business plans on BBC One's The Apprentice. In History Extra's new series, History's Greatest Leaders, I am talking to experts about some of the past's most remarkable people. Individuals who use their skills to leave a lasting legacy. We've had some great episodes already. If you don't want to miss a future show, don't forget to like and subscribe. In today's episode, I'm joined by Shushma Malik, who is Associate Professor in Classics at the University of Cambridge. Shushma, thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We're going to be discussing a figure from ancient history who's perhaps not as well known as some of the other leaders in this series, but she definitely deserves to be, because she took on the might of the Roman Empire, if nothing else. That person is 3rd century Queen Zenobia. Shushma, introduce us to Zenobia in a nutshell. What is her key claim to fame? And why is she such an interesting figure for us to be talking about when we think about history's greatest leaders?
The first reason, perhaps, for thinking about someone like Zenobia is precisely because we're thinking about a woman, which in antiquity isn't always the case. There might be other sort of women that you have heard of from the ancient world, like Roman empresses, Livia, Agrippina the Younger, who's the mother of Nero. But this is someone who ruled over Palmyra, over Syria, not quite in her own right. She was doing it as the regent for her son, who was very young at the time.
She's somebody who takes on the might of the Roman Empire. She inflicts punishing military defeats on them. Yet, this isn't necessarily the Roman Empire as we might picture it, is it? By the 3rd century AD, when Zenobia rises to prominence, Rome is in trouble politically and also economically. So maybe set the scene. Tell us a bit about what the Roman world is like then.
Sure. So the Roman Empire sort of reached its height in the 2nd century in geographical terms, its largest extent in the 2nd century AD. Now it's sort of reducing a bit because there are a lot of problems on the frontiers, a lot of border territory issues, particularly in the east, where you've got the Persian Empire sort of just over the border. And the Persian Empire are really pushing at Rome at this point. They also have sort of problems in the northern frontiers as well, also in this part of the Roman Empire in this time period. In 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla made everybody who was free, or most people who were free actually, in the Roman Empire citizens. So these are citizens we're talking about when we think about people in Syria or we think about people in Gaul. So that's another big kind of part of the way we understand what the Roman Empire looked like at this point. And what we also have is a very high turnover of emperors. There are a lot of sort of military men who are getting the backing of their armies and being raised to be emperor, but not lasting very long, to be honest. A lot of them are sort of coming and going quite quickly.
When you say coming and going, how do they tend to end their reign then, these short-lived ones?
Yeah, quite brutally. So by coming and going, it's a sort of euphemistic way of saying, well, their army raises them up and then they fight and then they are killed often. So there is quite a lot of upheaval in this period of Roman history. That lasts from 235 AD till about 284, and then we get a different kind of form of government in the Roman Empire that stabilizes things. But Zenobia is sort of right bang in the middle of that period of upheaval.
And I'm taking from what you say then, you've got this kind of rather overstretched Roman Empire by this point, so quite difficult to govern at its extremes. Would that be
Yes,
right?
it's large, certainly, and that's also part of the reason why it's sort of decreasing at this point as well, because maintaining that size of an empire is very difficult as one person. And actually, when it does stabilise, it's because it's recognised you need more than one person. There's an emperor leading the way in the east and an emperor leading the way in the west, and that's the sort of system that becomes part of the way that Rome governs for a while. Then it goes back, and so all kind of political history gets a bit complicated. But certainly in this point, we sort of see the ramifications of the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, to the point that actually we're starting to get kind of splintered off sections. So
Hmm.
you mentioned Gaul. So in the west, there's a sort of Gallic Empire that sort of splintered itself off. Again, all Roman citizens here, and in the east also. Part of the context of Zenobia's story is that the emperors really need help from sort of people in the east who they can trust.
Yeah.
And that's part of also the context that gives us people being able to wield actually quite a lot of power.
So that's really useful context for the world that she comes into and takes power in. There's something that, a contradiction, I guess, that the sources apparently are divided over. Is Zenobia a skilled leader? So, a real worthy opponent to the Roman Empire? Or is she more of an opportunist, taking advantage of its weakened and stretched circumstances?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right to point to the sources. And we do have, in terms of our literary sources, so where we might get sort of a narrative of this happened, this happened, this happened at these times, they're much later. And one of our main sources is something called the Historia Augusta, which is, it's not too much of an overstatement to say essentially made up. It's quite fictionalized. So it can be quite difficult actually to get underneath these sorts of character-based questions, because a lot of what probably that source and others as well are doing is sort of telling you what the propaganda was. So what is it that the Roman emperors put out there when she was defeated? How do they want her to look? What do they want her to look like as an enemy? So they're sort of conflicting narratives. So one narrative would be she was a very good leader, very strong. That's why she took on, the Roman Empire in the way that she could, or emperors in the way that she did. The other is that, yes, okay, but ultimately she is a woman. So she is never going to be as adept at leadership as a man. And that's a Roman narrative. I don't think that's true of a narrative in Syria, in Palmyra. They were used to women, owning property, maintaining accounts, doing all sorts of things. In Rome, women could do that as well. It's just part of the discourse that they are seen as not as effective in these sort of key areas that leadership requires.
That's really an interesting thing to bear in mind then as we move on,
Mm.
is that there are these kind of dual, slightly contradictory views of Zenobia, and it'd be interesting to see which parts we kind of play into. As you've said, there is a little bit about the complications of sources from such a distant period of history. So many of the sources that exist were written as propaganda centuries later.
Mhm.
But what do we know about Zenobia's background before she takes power?
Sure, yeah. So she comes from an elite family. We don't really know who her mother is. Her father may have been a man named Antiochus, who also had some sort of status. So Zenobia is someone who would have had a good education. We do, I mean, again, a bit of a pinch of salt, but we are told that she has a sort of Greek teacher of rhetoric called Longinus, who was supposed to have kind of helped her education, particularly when she was an adult. So there is an idea that she is very well educated, both in terms of literature, but also, we might think of that going hand in hand with the sort of skills you need to be a leader, rhetoric and oratory. So she is, we don't know a huge amount about her family, but that's the sort of things that we can glean.
Okay, so that's her background. How does she kind of rise to prominence? Because you don't go from that background to immediately announcing that you are empress. So
No,
so
that's so
she
true.
she marries.
She does. So she's born, we think, around 240-ish AD. It's not entirely clear, but somewhere around there. So she gets married probably when she's about 14 years old. That's about the age that elite women in the Roman Empire would get married. When they essentially are able to bear children. That's the point. So we're in sort of the mid 250s now in terms of when she gets married, and she is matched, again because she's an elite. She's matched with someone who is also very prominent. So Odenaithus is her husband. He's been married once before. He already has a son. We know, maybe other children as well. We're not quite sure. But he is someone who is a very good friend of the Romans. So he's been helping them with their problems with Persia, because Syria is sort of a buffer state between the main Roman Empire and Persia. So he is someone who has a good amount of status with the ruling system in Rome. So he's does very well, in particular with an emperor named Gallienus from 260 onwards. So she marries well, we might say. She is elite herself, but it seems to be a match that also bears children. So sometime probably in the late 250s, around then, she has a son. And probably other children as well, but we're not quite sure.
The sources don't exactly say.
No, they're not. They're not so interested. They do mention that she had daughters, but it's not clear. Yes, exactly when or how many.
And how does the city that she is in, Palmyra, how does that influence Zenobia's identity?
So Palmyra is a very wealthy city. It's a very affluent city. It's an important city in the Roman Empire. It's also a part of the buffer state between Rome and Persia. So actually strategically it's quite well placed for doing the kinds of work as a loyal politician that Rome needs you to do. So to sort of help with threats from Persia, which there have been growing and growing and growing increasingly, and that's something that both Odenaithus can capitalise on, and then later on Zenobia as well. The other thing, though, the sort of caveat to that is because she is of Aramaic background, living in Syria, our sources really play on the sort of orientalising, essentially, stereotypes that would come with that, and there are sort of, that comes with accusations of things like luxury and not really being able to control yourself fully, and those sort of stereotypes of people who are a little bit further away from the centre in Rome. But
so kind of louche. I mean,
yeah,
okay,
exactly.
Okay. They don't have the same iron discipline as
precisely.
they're not a real Roman.
Well, and that's the rub, because already at this point we've had an emperor from Africa who was married to a woman from Syria. Her son Caracalla becomes an emperor, and then we have another emperor from Syria called Elagabalus, and then his cousin Alexander Severus. So it's a bit of a difficult game, because on the one hand you've got the way people talk about it in writing, but on the other hand you've got the reality of emperors and imperial families from different places of the empire, and these are all Roman citizens fundamentally.
It's fascinating, isn't it, to see how issues and conflict around national identity and those values, they're not a modern phenomenon, are they?
No, absolutely not. And this time period, it actually is a really good case study for thinking about that, I think, because you do, from the sort of late 2nd century into the 3rd century onwards, you do get the way in which political dynamics function in relation to the wider empire is really interesting, precisely because you have emperors coming from lots of different places.
Zenobia herself, she is no Boudica, is she? I mean, in the sense that she might be from the very eastern reaches of the empire, but she is a Roman. She's not actually an outsider, even though she will go on to act like the insurgent. She is Roman.
Absolutely. Yeah, and her husband was a Roman senator. We know that from various types of evidence, because we also have archaeological evidence as well, so inscriptions and coins and that kind of thing that can help us along. So yeah, Roman senator as a husband. And as I've said, there has been an empress from Syria before. So actually she's very well sort of connected and integrated into what we would think of as sort of, someone who could expect to be a ruling elite elite in the Roman Empire.
So this brings us to our first major pivot point, which is the moment that Zenobia takes absolute control of Palmyra following the assassination of her husband in 267 AD.
Yeah.
Tell us what happens. What was her husband doing at that particular point? And what happens? In what way is he assassinated?
The sources are, not particularly coherent on this point. But he had done very well for himself as someone who was loyal to Rome. He'd got his own titles. He called himself King of Kings by this point, which is actually a nod to Persia as well. And he's sort of trusted by the emperor of the time, which was a man named Gallienus, to sort of take care of the East, essentially. Just be trusted and be there so that Gallienus could go off and deal with things in the West and other frontiers. And that's sort of where we're at in 267. He was assassinated by whom we're not quite sure, possibly a conspiracy amongst political elites in Palmyra, possibly another member of his family who wanted to have some power. One source implicates Zenobia, but that's highly unlikely, I think it's fair to say. And other sources implicate the Roman emperor himself. So was Gallienus not feeling like he needed Odenathus, or Odenathus might be getting too big for his boots? And was Gallienus thinking of sort of, pushing back on Odenathus himself? So there are
bringing
lots
that
of different
part
ones.
of the empire kind of back under heel.
Yeah, back under his sort of direct control. It's still part of the Roman Empire. We still have an emperor, but what did he want to kind of exactly take things back a bit more direct control?
Well, if it was that, it didn't quite work out, did it? Tell us about the immediate aftermath. What does Zenobia do? How does she grasp the reins of power?
Yeah, so it's also useful to note that not only was Odenathus killed, a son who would have been old enough to take control is assassinated at the same time. And Verbalathus, who is the son of Odenathus and Zenobia, is very young. He's probably around 10, maybe.
Okay.
We're not quite sure, but somewhere around there at this stage. So actually, Zenobia then is in the position to take power as a regent, as it were. So she's doing it in the name of her son. Her son, is key to all of this. He appears on coins with the emperor, and these sorts of things. So we've got a situation where she is able to actually have control, I think it's fair to say, but through that sort of mechanism of regency.
Okay, so there is an extraordinary land grab here, but she has a fig leaf at the very least. Which is smart, right?
And important, yeah.
I think most things that leaders do, they have real reasons and good reasons to do them. And real reasons are actually why you've really done something, and good reasons tend to be the justifications for those things. It sounds like she had those lined up really nicely. And it's an incredibly bold move on Zenobia's part, right? It's that great saying that, it is better to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission in the first place.
Right.
It seems like, she moved into the vacuum that was created really quickly. Would that be fair? And what traits do you think led to her acting so quickly?
Because most of our sources come from that kind of slightly skewed viewpoint, it would be kind of quite easy to fall into the trap and think that she's done something, that she shouldn't have done or whatever. But actually, for a woman to take power like that isn't necessarily, seen as problematic or extraordinary or grab at really anything. I mean, it's natural that she would do that for her son while he is still so young. But what she does do when she becomes the leader, de facto leader, is she manages things very carefully. So for the first couple of years, between sort of 268 to 270, we have another emperor in Rome. So Gallienus also dies in 268. And there's a new emperor called Claudius the second, and the way in which she sort of tries to maintain a kind of balance of, as her husband had done, a balance between the Roman emperor and herself as a sort of caretaker of the East, as it were. She tries to maintain that. So coins that are coming out of Syria at this point, show the emperor, first and foremost on the obverse, the head side of the coin, and then her son on the tail side of the coin, those kinds of things. So she manages it very carefully. She's not trying to position herself as some sort of, supreme leader or anything like that. She's very much, playing the same sort of game that her husband had done. The problem is, Claudius, it seems, is much less receptive to having someone in the East with that much power, essentially, than Gallienus had been.
Then, after that period of relative stability, where Zenobia is playing a well-established role here, I'm keeping things quiet, I'm still respecting the ultimate authority, things change because she ends up going to war.
Yes, so one way to read it, and again, sorry, I keep saying this, but the evidence is a little bit sketchy. But one of the ways we might interpret this is that because Claudius was a different kind of emperor, if he was getting more hostile, she feared essentially for any sort of sense of dynastic succession. So for her son, essentially that the power dynamic would change, that things would therefore be more volatile. They'd be more open to Persia. Essentially, they'd be more open to having some sort of grab from the other side. You can sort of see also for sort of the safety of the region that she lives in, the region that she wants her son to have some position in as well. That would be compromised if the emperor, which it seems Claudius was sort of going down that road, if the emperor did try and remove that family from any sort of position of power.
So there's ambiguity there.
Yeah.
But through that, there is certainly a sense of her family being under threat. So what happens then? Does she take kind of unilateral action? Does she launch essentially a military operation before she feels it's going to happen to her?
Yeah, so that's certainly one way we can look at this. The other thing to note is in 270, when she does decide to sort of take some action, we get another emperor. So we've got quite a quick turnover now. The next one is called Aurelian, who is the one that sort of mainly features in her story. I think it's fair to say Aurelian becomes emperor and seems to be following the same sort of line as Claudius had, not particularly giving her reassuring signs that the power will remain hers. So she decides she's going to consolidate her region, and so she goes to Arabia, the Roman province of Arabia, first, and then to Egypt, and essentially sort of annexes those areas.
And that's a really serious threat to Rome, right? Because you control Egypt, and in particular, if you control the port of Alexandria, that all of a sudden means that you control the supply of grain that feeds the rest of the empire. It's a knife against the throat, right?
It's strategically clever, yes, I think it's fair to say. You're absolutely right that a lot of grain comes from Egypt, that's going back to Rome, that's going back to Italy. So that is, a really kind of significant part of the Roman Empire. It's also a prestigious part of the Roman Empire as well, and to take that is something. It's interesting because our sources don't say she stopped the grain. She just controlled it. So there's also, you can see kind of ideas there that what she's trying to do isn't necessarily, cut off a lifeline, cut off, Rome's food supply, but she's making the point that, it's now sort of, administered by her.
Yeah, I mean, that is leverage.
That is.
in any future negotiation, if you're concerned about your own position or your son's life, then having leverage like that. And in terms of, we've made it sound like she just kind of wandered in there and did that, but presumably there was a great deal of fighting and bloodshed.
Yeah, so and also it wasn't personally her who wandered in there and did that. She had generals, so there are a few names that we have, but so she isn't. She sort of she's the strategy, a strategic person, if you like, and then she sent a general that she trusted into Egypt to make those manoeuvres, but. The other thing to remember is there would have been quite a few people who were originally from Palmyra in Egypt as well, because we have migration, people are moving around. So our sources don't go heavy on the bloodshed at this point. However, they are sketchy, so it's very difficult to say. But I think it's certainly. War is war, isn't it?
Yes.
And conquest is conquest. So we do have, those considerations as well.
So do you think here Zenobia is she actively trying to either destroy the Roman Empire or certainly run it all, or is it that she is trying to create a substantial power base of her own? Do we have any sense?
Yeah, so I really don't think she's trying to destroy the Roman Empire or trying to do some sort of massive power grab where she sees herself as the only empress. But what we might want to say, and I think is a bit more plausible, is that she sees a sort of co-rulership situation. So as we also have going on in the West, where you've got people in charge of Gaul, and as we will actually go on to have later on when everything settles down, more than one emperor in the Roman Empire, you can kind of see strategically that she might be thinking, well, I can kind of rule this bit, and then Aurelian can rule his bit, and then if someone else needs to rule somewhere else, then they can. But I don't think it's that doesn't mean it's breaking up the empire either, though. It's existing within the Roman Empire, just having different leaders in different parts of it.
Yes.
And,
so it becomes a tripartite.
Yeah, we sometimes call it sort of splinter empires, but that sort of idea, I think, was probably what she sort of had in mind.
So whether that was her stated strategy or not, she is now on a direct collision course with Rome's new formidable emperor that you talked about, Aurelian. What happened?
Yeah, so she manages to maintain this sort of splinter empire for a couple of years, so from 270 to 272. Aurelian is busy in the West. He's got other battles to fight, as it were, at that stage. But then his attention does turn to Zenobia and to the east. So at that stage, we do get a series of probably about 3 battles. They're really quite devastating for Zenobia. So she doesn't, even though Rome is in the center of Rome is in having the problems that it's having, still the military might of Rome in some way. So she isn't really able to put up a fight against Aurelian when he comes.
And there's a siege of Palmyra, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So
give us some detail on what that was like.
There are a few smaller battles, and then we lead up to the siege of Palmyra, and really kind of again we get descriptions of just the force of Aurelian, just devastating essentially Zenobia, that she didn't have very much of a chance when it got to that stage, and again the sort of military tactics and the way in which the Aurelian was able to conduct that battle really kind of spelled the end, and she realised that, which is why she tried to flee. But I will also again add the caveat that these are Roman sources that are telling us this, so you would expect.
Yes,
that,
a glorious Roman victory against the odds.
Yeah, precisely.
But we suspect it was probably a lot more brutal than those sources would suggest.
Yes, exactly, and actually not a glorious Roman victory against the odds, a glorious Roman victory precisely because that's what the Romans do.
Right.
They win. Again, Zenobia is also Roman, but the Romans in the centre of the empire.
So this leads us to our second major pivot point: Zenobia's military defeat, her capture, and then the competing accounts of her downfall. Could you kind of pick the bones out of what happens.
Yeah, so Zenobia tries to escape. She gets on a camel, we're told, and she tries to go over to Persia. Actually, she's stopped just sort of shy of the Euphrates. Before she can cross, and so she's captured by Aurelian, by the emperor, and she's taken back to Emesa to stand trial, essentially, which happens, and it's at this stage our sources sort of say that she starts to blame her commanders, so the men, she starts to blame.
Men, eh?
Exactly. That's sort of part of what's going on, and as they're trying to kind of decide what goes on with this region afterwards. Then our sources, again, they're sketchy and they're conflicting. So one says, probably wrongly, that she died on the way back to Rome, and that she never made it
Mhm.
back. So she died in 272, which is sort of where we are now. Others say that she went back to Rome. There was a triumph. She was put in chains. Others say she was then killed at that point, as a sort of prisoner of war. Others say Aurelian gave her a villa in Tivoli, which is also famous for Hadrian's villa, and allowed her and her children to live there.
Hmm.
And that's probably the right one, because other types of evidence that we have from later on show or strongly suggest that she married a Roman senator. Her daughters may have married Roman senators as well, and that in sort of from naming conventions we can see that the family kind of lived on, as it were. So probably the most likely story is that she was allowed to remain alive for how long we don't know.
Which is quite extraordinary, really, isn't it? And quite a testament to how charismatic
Mm.
Zenobia must have been. To not be put to the sword at that particular point, to have the kind of personality and to be sufficiently articulate to be able to
Absolutely.
talk your way out of it says something about the leader that she must have been.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important point, because we do get so little from our sources that tell us anything concrete. But the very fact of sort of her existence into beyond 272 really does suggest that she she was able to demonstrate perhaps her value, integrating within as an elite woman, with
Hmm.
being able to live out her time, being able then to marry again, all of these sorts of things just sort of demonstrate the way in which she, strategically managed her
Mm.
life, as it were, and her legacy, and also, her children's lives as well.
And it is one of the things that, kind of leaders very seldom talk about, which is how do you lose well?
Mm,
Because sometimes inevitably you will. And people tend to plan for success
yeah.
because they won't allow themselves to have a contingency plan or a plan B that sees them, tactically surrendering or whatever. Because even to have that plan, it kind of feels like, oh, well, it might take us towards that. In some way, it's tempting the fates. But clearly, she had thought about all of these eventual scenarios.
Yeah, no, it seems that way, certainly, and that idea that she was very successful in her defeat. She was able to manage that situation. We don't hear that much, to be honest, in our sources when we
Mm.
see people go up against sort of Roman emperors. It's not something we come across every day. Someone like Cleopatra, who we know for taking her own life because she didn't want to be paraded in Rome. Zenobia managed to find her way through that situation, it seems, somehow,
Mm.
and do that quite successfully.
I wonder whether, in retrospect, in her older age, living in her comfortable villa in the Tivoli, whether she reflected on the dangers of overreach or overexpansion. I mean, here is
Mm.
somebody, it sounds like, could well have been a very comfortable ruler of the part of the world we now know as Syria
Yeah.
without that kind of overexpansion there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the view that she did what she did because she didn't think she was going to be able to maintain that position in Syria, that the emperor would have come and sort of taken it. Aurelian, and Claudius before him seemed to be making moves in that direction. So I don't necessarily think she had, or saw much of a choice
So
in what
offense
she was
was the best
doing.
form of defense in that
Yeah,
way.
precisely. So I hope as she's living in her villa in Tivoli, she can reflect on those decisions in a in a more positive sense.
So let's go back to that contradiction at the very start. Was she just a great strategic leader of people, or more of an opportunist who just saw the gap in the market appearing and jumped into it?
Mm.
When we strip away the myth and the legend, Shushma, I'm going to give you the final word on this. What's your take on Zenobia's legacy as a leader?
Yeah, I am of the mind of the former, that she is someone who had a strategy, that someone who was thinking about, what the Roman Empire was looking like at that point, but someone who sort of saw the dangers, saw the problems, is negotiating both Rome and Persia on the other side as well, has to think in a very sort of big way about these problems and how to manage them. So I don't particularly see her as an opportunist, I have to say. But actually, you could find a source to back up whatever you like with Zenobia. So
Well, no, the good thing is it's your final word, and that is the final word that we're going to take.
excellent, thank
Shushma,
you.
thank you so much. And that's all we've got time for today. Shushma Malik, thank you again so much for being with us. That was absolutely fascinating. If you want to find out more about the fascinating period in which Zenobia lived and some of the other remarkable female leaders of the ancient world, the History Extra team has put together a wealth of articles, podcasts, and videos. You'll find the link to those in the description to this episode. We'll be back soon for more of history's greatest leaders, but for more fascinating content on some of the past's most powerful people, visit the History Extra app now.